get back to the basics here. With some aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So, I believe we got through the aggregate supply stuff, kinda. And tackle some aggregate demand. Yeah, I can get that out here. All right, so the basics of this is to help us understand a lot of moving parts in the economy, is the reason that we're doing it. And so what are the three goals that we hope our policymakers are taking into account?
Low unemployment.
Low unemployment, economic growth, which is increasing what variable?
Real GDP.
Real GDP. And then finally,
Low stable
inflation. Right. So, we have inflation being measured on the vertical axis, real GDP on the horizontal axis, and we had a long-run aggregate supply curve that was vertical. Why? Why was long-run aggregate supply curve vertical? What does that mean? Unchanged by inflation. So the supply, if you want to think about it this way, the supply of stuff is ultimately independent of prices because we're trying to crack that real problem. So I spent a little bit of time reviewing the production possibilities frontier. Is it dependent upon resources and technology? So what does that composition of our resource base look like? That's what really determines our ability to produce in the long run. However, in the short run, there may be some trade-offs with higher output and inflation, because why? What was our hypothesis for that? We got a trade-off, output going up. If we move from point A to point B here, output's going up and to Y1, and inflation has gotten higher. I guess let me give that a 1, that 2, Y2, and I2. What was going on there? Chisholm, number between 4 and 7. Oh, Zach was chomping at the bit, but that's all right. 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Dallas. Why are we able to get some sort of trade-off, more production for higher inflation? It was kind of a key point there. Zach, you want to help? Because why? Yeah. Why do we have a trade-off? So I think, tell a pretty compelling story here to say, you know what, we can only produce so much crap in the nation. This is it. But yet we can move beyond that potential in the short run, where we're showing a trade-off between higher prices and more GDP, more production. Why? Should be in your notes from last time. Look at
prices, input, output.
Good. Inputs and output prices are potentially different. They change at different rates. And so which one changed first and faster? Output prices or input prices? Output prices. And so we got this lag time where over here, when we think about inflation, we're thinking about an upward increase of all prices. But potentially if we have output prices going up, but resource prices staying the same, then producers are going to supply more because they can sell their product for more, but they're not paying any more costs. You want to kind of think of it loosely that way. Conceptually, that's the type of thing we're going for. But that's not going to be something that's able to be done forever. And so then there's going to be some adjustments, and that's part of what we'll talk about here as we enter aggregate demand into the picture. Okay, so let's see, we derived the aggregate demand curve and talked about why it's downward sloping, if I remember right, correct? Why downward sloping or something for demand? Yeah.
Started.
Okay, so our aggregate demand, I'll start to put all of these together. Our aggregate demand can be thought of to be composed of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. All we're doing is we're pulling a chapter out of the expenditure approach to measuring GDP, where we conveniently compartmentalize, somewhat arbitrarily, by the way, we compartmentalized our cigarettes, that we think of consumption goods by households, investment by businesses, which is purchases of machines and equipment, government purchases, weapons of mass destruction and otherwise, and then finally net exports, what we sell to the rest of the world minus what we buy from them. So exports minus imports. So if we think about it that way, this aggregate demand curve can be thought of as based on consumption goods, investment goods, net exports. And these are the components of aggregate demand, the demanders of goods and services, economy-wide, which makes it a little sticky. All right, so what are some aggregate demand shifters? I'm just going to make a list that you should probably have memorized. Number one, taxes. So taxes, an increase in taxes does what in terms of entering one of these guys down here? Who does that affect? Possibly a couple channels, but who's going to be hit with an increase in income taxes? Consumers, right? So consumers are going to have a decrease in disposable income, which we'll use the Y subscript D. So that's income after taxes. So recall disposable income, gross income minus taxes equals disposable income, the amount of the money that I get to choose what to do with. The government kind of chose for me weapons, mass destruction, and whatever else they're spending their money on. And so then I have the choice with my disposable income what's left over. So with less disposable income, we're going to get less consumption, and therefore a decrease in aggregate demand. Remember, a down arrow is a shift to the left graphically. So on our graph, this thing will start to shift to left. What starts to happen with inflation? It starts to go up. We start to see that now, and also causes output to fall below potential if we're starting at point A. We'll get to a new equilibrium point to the left. All right. Questions on taxes? Let me put a little extra note in for this one too. Sometimes we talk about tax rates rather than tax collections, big T. So you can also show that big T might be equal to little t times my income for an income tax. Right? Tax rate's 10%. I make $100,000. I pay $10,000 in tax. All right, now 2 is a change in autonomous consumption. Change in autonomous consumption. All right, so what autonomous means is it's independent of income. So this is independent of income. So from macro class a long time ago, those of you who had these types of details anyway, just fairly basic for principles. The consumption function, C, is equal to, in a linear form, A plus, I'm just going to write it out instead of cutting to the chase here, MPCY. So this is slope-intercept form of a line. You want to think of it that way. My consumption is based on my income, which makes sense at a personal finance level, right? You go to work, get a paycheck, you get to go run to Walmart and buy some groceries. So part of my consumption is based on my income, but sometimes I still get to eat even if I don't make any income. So through previous savings, perhaps, or through a gift from grandma, right? So that little A part is the autonomous part of consumption. So this is autonomous consumption. This part is my marginal propensity to consume. So the MPC is the fraction of income for consumption, spending. So if I save 10%, that means I'm consuming 90% of my income. So this would be 0.9. So if I make $100,000 a year, 0.9 times 100,000 gives me $90,000 worth of income. Grandma gave me a little bit of money as a Thanksgiving gift. Add those two together, gives me my total consumption. Okay? Questions on that one? All right, so the way this formula goes then is if there's an increase in A, an increase in A leads to an increase in consumption, which leads to a shift to the right of the aggregate demand, to bring it back to our aggregate demand. Number 3, government purchases. Government goes out and buys a new weapon of mass destruction. There's an increase in G. That just kind of ties in nicely here. Remember, you can also, the expenditure approach is C plus I plus G plus X, which kind of helps us with the sign. If G goes up, aggregate demand goes up. So an increase in aggregate demand, or I'm sorry, an increase in government spending leads to an increase in aggregate demand. So all we're doing is really just chipping off the list here of the C plus I plus G and X. So net exports is next. A change in autonomous net exports. Change in autonomous net exports. Oh, your textbook, I forgot to say this, let's see, they don't really use it there, but your textbook puts a little bar over the top just for notation purposes. So all of these are autonomous changes. So autonomous, that word autonomous, independent, you kind of show it that little bar. If you want to make a little note to yourself, you'll see that in the text. All right, so suppose there's an increase in inflation for the rest of the world. So foreigners' inflation is going up while the United States is staying constant. What's going to happen to net exports? Increase, right? So our stuff looks more attractive. U.S. goods looks more attractive than foreign goods because their prices are going up. Ours are relatively cheaper, and so that would be an increase in net exports, an increase in aggregate demand.
Do we have to do a line over both the annexes?
Huh?
Do we have to do a line over the annex and the version?
You can, yes. Another example, so let's just say this is kind of example one. Another way that can happen is if the foreigners get more rich. What if their real GDP, the rest of the world's GDP is going up while ours is staying constant? What's our impact on our exports? It would go up again, right? So they have more income, they're going to buy more of our stuff also. So that would again go the same direction. Okay, and number 5. Any questions on that one? Autonomous investment. Autonomous investment. So what if there's an increase in profit expectations due to the incoming presidency? Profit expectations go up because of at least campaign rhetoric of reduced regulations and reduced or better environment. So in general, profit expectations. Increase or decrease? Increase, right? So it's going to increase investment. People are going to start buying more machines and investing in their businesses, and that's going to lead to a shift to the right of aggregate demand. Okay. I guess I'll sneak in here. So monetary policy might come in a couple different forms. So if there's autonomous, what are we on, number 6? Autonomous monetary policy. Through interest rates. So if there's an increase in interest rates, increase or decrease in aggregate demand? Increase in interest rates. Decrease, right? So a contractionary monetary policy. And then finally, financial frictions. Another one with the Trump campaign that I think is being talked about, at least. financial frictions. So regulations in the financial industry especially, uncertainty, if there's an increase in frictions, that'll lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. All right. So, we've got a lot of stuff going on there. So you'll see lots of potential ways that we can go about trying to analyze equilibrium levels. And so if there's a increase in government spending, let's say. So let's do an example. So what I have drawn on the board, with the exception of that pi 2, you can think of as our macroeconomic home base minus this pi 2, right? So we have some initial inflation rate. We've got some initial level of real GDP. And maybe this is even confusing. Let me, well, you guys can draw a new one if you want. I'll probably end up redrawing it almost right there, but that's okay. So, what is equilibrium? What is equilibrium? So, as usual, it's where the two lines cross, but we actually have 3 lines now, which makes it a little more confusing. And so, if there is an increase in government spending, shifting the aggregate demand curve to AD2. The argument goes that we can move from point A to point B, where output expands to Y2, and inflation increase. Let's call it point B. So one form of equilibrium is a short-run equilibrium, and that's where the short-run aggregate supply curve intersects the aggregate demand curve. So that's at this level here. So what is equilibrium? In the short run, it is always the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. In the long run, it is where all 3 intersect. All right, so if this is the picture where we have what's called an output gap, this is an inflationary gap, but this is called the output gap. I can't remember if this book uses the term inflationary gap or not, but it's just it's a positive output gap. Sometimes it's called an inflationary gap. because our current level of real GDP exceeds our potential. How do we get back to long-run equilibrium? What's the mechanism in play? Another way to say it is, how do we get to point B in the first place? Let me go back to Derek. Not to pick on you, but you gave a brilliant answer earlier, so I want you to show off again. How did we get to point B?
Just how the prices were changed first.
Good. And so what is going to be the Adam Smith invisible hand that's going to correct the imbalance, if you will, to get us back to long-run equilibrium?
You say you would lower the price.
Yeah, would it lower? Input prices would catch up. So you got to kind of remember the narrative that we were saying is that output prices go up, input prices will follow later. Well, following later means input prices are going to eventually rise too. So if wages are sticky, is the word that Keynes used, if there are sticky wages, resource prices tend to lag behind output prices, then the natural mechanism for the economy would be price adjustment in the form of resource prices going up. So resource prices are going to be moving up, causing a leftward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. And it's going to stop when we get here. And so that's our point C, which is a new short-run equilibrium, by the way, and long-run equilibrium, right? Short-run is always that short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect each other. And then long-run in the sense that we're back to our potential level of output. The output gap is gone. The output gap is shrunk, and we're right at our potential at this new level of inflation, pi 3. All right, questions on that? So the magic question is, how long does this take to move from A to B to C? How long does it take to move from A to B to C? Well, that is the million-dollar question that economists fight about. How long does it take to get from A to B to C? So the classical economists and those that believe that markets move fairly quickly, like Milton Friedman, our monetary quantity theory of money guy, he would say this happens fairly quickly. He might agree that there can be some rigidity in the labor market due to some actioner, but for the most part, we move from A to B to C fairly quickly. Whereas Keynes argued in 1936, the general theory, that in the long run, we're all dead, meaning he thought that this would be a fairly long process. Derek?
Is this kind of like, it's not really going for the three goals, because you're not really moving anywhere for real GDP, what you're
Yeah, I kind of, so the three goals are just kind of there to have a mental framework of whether things are going good or bad. So the trade-off here from A to B is that prices got higher, which is bad, but output went up. But now it gets even worse when we go from B to C, right? Because we've got output going down, which is bad, and prices even getting higher. So there's kind of a double bad going on.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Should we not want that?
Well, yes, in some cases. So we might be putting the cart before the horse because we didn't really talk about should the government have done the purchases of weapons of mass destruction in the first place, right? So we were here, should they have done that? So we got to take bits and pieces at a time, but sounded like you might be arguing from Keynes' standpoint to say, let's not wait to go to C. Let's try to get back to A, maybe, because at least inflation's going the right direction. And how could we do that with monetary policy? What would Janet do if she thought this was getting, hey, this is getting a little uncomfortable, that's a little too high, you know, the economy's heating up pretty good, what might she do? Raise interest rates. So cause a contractionary monetary policy and do this. And so now you've got the idea of the Federal Reserve, or possibly Congress, if we're talking fiscal policy, but using active policy to offset some of these changes. So, and that's part of the heart of what we're looking at. So, just thought that we should use government policy to actively manage the economy, because if the economy needs a little nudge, well, let's just buy some weapons of mass destruction or something. If the economy's getting a little too hot, maybe we should use some monetary policy and throttle it back. So we're kind of going through this tuning process for the economy with active government policy. Whereas other economists argue that you're screwing things up more than you're helping. So Friedman would argue these price adjustments will happen on their own in fairly short order, and by you introducing monetary and fiscal policy, you're creating more uncertainty. People can't make as good of decisions or as efficient of decisions, and so you end up creating more harm than good, is what other economists would argue. And that's exactly what we're going to play with here, are these types of thoughts on different opinions, and then there's been lots of different models over time. Okay, any other last comments? I'll write a little bit here. So how long does it take to move from A to B? For Keynes, he said in the long run, we are all dead. We're all dead. So he thought it was a pretty long time. So he thought that there was sticky prices, wage rigidities. So wage rigidity make for a slow process. And so his solution was to use government policy. The solution, use active government policy. Whereas Friedman and another guy that we're going to talk a little bit about, Hayek, these were more free market economists. Friedman, Hayek would say prices move fairly quickly to bring us back to long-run equilibrium. And maybe even more importantly, they thought government policy screws things up. Government policy tends to distort prices and behavior in such a way that more harm than good is caused. All right, so any other last questions or comments on the setup? All right, I've got an Excel exercise for you guys over the break. You won't have any other homework. If you were looking at the dates, I changed the date for the homework for 23. At a conference, I had a guy, this was a long time ago, this was back in 2012, that, let's see, I guess I gotta shove in my gizmo here. He came up with a way to monitor the economy in kind of an aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. The problem with what we've done on the graph so far is that real GDP data is often not known until 6 months after the fact. Like what GDP is this month or this quarter won't really be known for 6 months, and it's potentially going to be revised after that as well. So he came up with kind of a clever thing. I just asked him to send me his slides again. Okay, so aggregate demand shifting, left and right. We saw the problems, where are we going, how can we do it? So he did this little flip of things. Here is the graph we were just doing. The deflator is the inflation rate, right? That's the GDP deflator. So that's just one of the indexes. So we got real GDP, deflator, short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand. And so at any given point in time, right here, X marks the spot, tells you inflation and real GDP. So we talked about the connection between real GDP and unemployment. Real GDP is up, unemployment is, real GDP is up, unemployment is down, right? So there was a connection there between the two. And this Phillips curve is something we'll talk about a little bit more later. But he said, that's kind of interesting. Since those two work that way, then another way to think about it is if we measure the employment rate and inflation. Kind of is similar to the short-run aggregate supply curve, right? So if inflation's going up, we have more real GDP, more employment. So this, I'm just going to kind of cut to the chase here, getting all the way through this. In order to have movement in the economy like the A to B to C, something's happening. These are the only directions. So if we see in the data employment going up and inflation going up, then we must have moved in that quadrant, right? So there was a movement along the aggregate supply curve, or possibly there was a couple things going. If this one went down and this one went up, we're moving this direction, this direction. So those are the directions that are possible with movements. So he gathered data from Fred, and this is part of what you guys are going to do for this exercise, and mapped out the possible points on a month-by-month basis. Because employment comes out once a month, inflation comes out once a month, and so he just started tracking it. And so this was in 2007. He's got the economy kind of going like this. What you can think about is that these are like little aggregate demand, aggregate supply curves that are moving. And both of them are potentially moving because there's so much stuff going on in the economy. So here we are in 7 of 08. Now what happened in 08? The financial crisis, right? It actually, in what time? Was it in fall? Spring? Summer? Winter?
Autumn.
it was when we were starting to reach the bad stuff of it, it was the fall. And so what he's showing here is how it's kind of neat to track this stuff. Employment's starting to fall, inflation's going up, right? So we kind of have this financial crisis maybe coming, maybe signaling to us that something's going to happen, I don't know. And then we have this big fall. This is month by month now. Month by month fall, prices are falling really fast, and employment is going down. And so here we are in 2009. And then we start to go up, maybe a little bit of a recovery. He seems to have a lot of data points that seem to be staying there for a while. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months worth of data, all here. So does that what an equilibrium looks like, right? We're kind of a little bit stable maybe. Some sort of equilibrium, short-run equilibrium, that's being a little bit persistent. And then we keep kind of mapping out. And there's 9/11, and then back to 12. So what's kind of neat with this approach that I had never seen before is that while you're in class, you can kind of think about current events as they're happening to see, is that having any effect in the moment, if you will, or within a month's time anyway, of the direction of the economy. So what was our event that we had happen here, what was it, a week ago now, 2 weeks? Yeah, presidential election. So that's going to be your charge here. I'll email this to you, or post it on Blackboard. So if you go to Fred, that data is pretty easily accessible. And you'll have what he did here so that you can look at what you're trying to measure and take the last 12 months and figure out how to graph it. So you're going to be on your own. It's a bit of a challenge exercise. Make sure you use kind of the connect the dot. You know how Excel has different dots. And get yourself a graph. Here's what your thing should kind of look like. You're going to be uploading your Excel spreadsheet. But I went ahead and did this with the most recent data. So it's kind of crazy looking here, right? So let me here it is. So you can go and dump the data. All I did was take the data from the last. I've got this going back to 1948. So you can take the data series and truncate it. Your assignment is to do the last 12 months, which is what I'm doing here. So from 10/1 to 10/1 is the last data point. And on your graph that you guys have in front of you, that's this point right here. So the economy, if we go backwards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 months ago was here. So 5 months ago we were over here, and then we had apparently a shift of the aggregate supply curve to the left, maybe with combination of demand, drop down, drop up, back. So where do you guys predict it's going to be 11/1, which they'll release at the end of this month? We'll get 11/1. So before this class ends, we'll get to add our last data point. What do you think? Seems like they're kind of erratic. Trump's in office now, though. That's the interesting thing about this data point, is that we're going to have people's behavior changing. Is that going to go this way? Is it going to go this way? It's kind of fun to speculate. I'm not sure there's anything you can really do. It seems pretty erratic, but that's what we need to do. So when you go to Fred, you can pull up this is the unemployment rate. And remember that they don't give you the employment rate, but they give you the unemployment rate. And so I kind of want you guys to play around with this so you can edit the graph. So this one, it starts off with 1948 to 2016. You can edit the graph and change it to percentages or what it was from year to year. So there's all kinds of choices that way. You can also manipulate the formula down here. So you can create a custom formula. So if you go, what's 100 minus A is the civilian labor force, they're calling it data set A or data series A. 100 minus A, apply those changes. And instead of the unemployment rate, we get the employment rate. Just like that. It's pretty cool. And then you can do your little slide bar, and you can download more data. So then to download it, come up to the download button, put it into Excel. It's not going to give you the graph, you're going to get the raw data. So when you open this thing up, you get this. So I wasn't even paying attention, but I went back to 2002, and then it's got the employment, and it gave me 100 minus the unrate. That was my formula that I put in, and this is the data all the way down. And then you guys get to make your own little chart. So you can insert a line chart or whatever you want, and boom. Except it would be helpful if you highlighted it. Okay? Questions? All right, we'll see you. Have a good turkey break. We'll see you Monday afterwards.
We won our game on Saturday. We will.
I heard that. Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you. However, pretty good gotten this in the week before finals.
Yeah. You're going to Alabama, huh? So, I guess if you can zoom in, that would be ideal.